She had tusks before she had a name. That was how the soldiers at Forward Operating Station Kale 7 thought of her when they first dragged her in from the wreckage of the Vorathi drop pod, the girl with the tusks, the one who hadn't died when she should have. She was maybe 19 cycles old by human reckoning, though it was hard to tell with orcs. Her skin was the color of old copper left too long in rain, her lower jaw pushing out 2 ivory points that had been filed down to modest curves, which meant she'd been civilized once, or at least someone had tried. She had a gash along her left side that had gone septic in the heat. Her right leg was broken in 2 places. She was barely conscious, barely breathing, and every instinct the station's commanding officer possessed told him to put her back in the rubble and walk away. Sergeant First Class Daria Voss did not walk away. Daria was 37 years old. She had brown hair going gray at the temples, a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her jaw from a shrapnel incident on Callum Station 4 years ago, and a habit of grinding her back teeth when she was thinking hard enough. She thought hard a lot. Her hands were the hands of someone who had rewired artillery targeting systems by feel in the dark, who had sutured wounds without anesthetic, who had once held a pressure seal on a blown hull joint for 9 hours until a relief crew arrived. She had 3 citations and 2 disciplinary marks, and a reputation among the enlisted for being the kind of person who would argue with God himself if God had the wrong coordinates. She argued with Lieutenant Farrow for 22 minutes over the orc girl. "She's a combatant," Farrow said. "She's a kid," Daria said. "We don't know her age. We don't know her orders either. She was in a drop pod that failed deorbit and crashed. That's not an assault, that's a malfunction. The Vorathi have been hitting this sector for 6 weeks. The Vorathi have been hitting this sector with drone swarms and suppression fire. This is one girl in a broken pod with a broken leg. She didn't hit anything. She barely survived landing." Farrow looked at the girl through the medbay window. The orc was unconscious. One of the medics, Specialist Roth, who was 22 and from a city called Durban and who had never seen an orc up close before, had cleaned the wound and set the leg and was now standing at the back of the room looking like he wasn't sure what he'd done. Like he'd set the leg of something that would wake up angry and was already regretting not having a plan for when that happened. "If she dies, she dies," Farrow said. "If she dies because we didn't treat her, that's on us. The regulations on Vorathi POWs don't cover crash survivors from non-hostile entry, sir." She let the "sir" land like a period, not a question. "I've read the regs. She doesn't qualify as a combatant under current row. She qualifies as a wounded non-combatant recovered from a crash site, which means we treat her." Farrow looked at her for a long moment. He was not a bad officer, really. He was tired and he was afraid, and the sector had been bleeding for 6 weeks, and sometimes tired, afraid people needed someone to argue them into the right thing. That was the thing about Farrow, he was persuadable. The trouble was that most of the people around him weren't trying to persuade him toward anything useful. They were just trying to get through their rotation without losing anyone they knew. "Fine," he said, "she's your problem." Daria went into the medbay and sat down next to the cot and looked at the orc girl for a while. Close up, the girl's face was striking in a way Daria hadn't expected, not alien strange but architecturally unusual, broad across the cheekbones, with a wide flat nose and a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that were closed now, but which she somehow already suspected would be a specific color when they opened. Her breathing was shallow but even. The medic had done good work on the leg. "Her name," Daria said to Roth. "Did you find anything, tags, markings, anything?" Roth pointed to the girl's right wrist. There was a band of braided cordage there, the kind Vorathi soldiers wore with personal sigils woven into them. He'd taken a photograph of it, blown it up, was working on a translation. "Preliminary," he said, "is that it says something like Jacques, could be a name. Could be a clan marker. Jacques, Daria said, trying the syllables. The girl's eyes opened. They were amber. Daria had been right. They were not frightened eyes. They were in too much pain to be frightened. They were just eyes, amber and dazed and sharp underneath the daze, focusing slowly on Daria's face with the careful deliberateness of someone trying to understand what they were looking at, not processing whether to be afraid, processing what the situation actually was. Daria recognized that kind of focus. She practiced it herself. She didn't move. She didn't reach for a weapon or for the door. She just sat there and let the girl look. After a moment she said, "You're okay, you crashed. We pulled you out, your legs set." The girl said something in Vorathi. It was a long, guttural sentence with clicks in it that the translation matrix in Daria's earpiece rendered as approximately, "You are the enemy. Why do you help me?" "Because you needed help," Daria said. The girl was quiet. The amber eyes moved around the medbay, taking inventory. Daria understood. Checking exits, checking for weapons, checking the population of the room. That was also something she recognized. That was what you did when you woke up somewhere you didn't choose. Then Jacques said, in very slow, very careful standard, the trade language of the Outer Rim worlds, which every Vorathi soldier was required to learn to a functional level. "I do not understand." "I know," Daria said. "That's okay. You don't have to right now." She stood up, pulled the thin thermal blanket up over the girl's shoulders the way you did for anyone who was in shock whether or not they showed it, and went out to file her incident report. Roth caught her at the door and said quietly, "What do I do with her when she can walk?" "Keep her occupied," Daria said. "Let her help if she asks to. Don't treat her like an exhibit." Roth thought about this. He was 22 and from Durban, and he had been in the Outer Rim for 4 months, and he was still, on some level, adjusting to the fact that the war out here looked nothing like the briefings had described. What if she asks to leave? She can't leave. We're a combat station, and she's a recovered crash survivor, and there's active engagement in this sector. That's not imprisonment, that's reality. Explain it to her like that. In standard. "Your Vorath is probably better than you think," Daria said. "Start using it." She went out into the corridor and filed her report, and then spent the next 2 hours in the sensor room going over the week's perimeter data, because that was the work and the work didn't stop. The sector did not get quieter in the weeks that followed. If anything, it got louder. The Vorathi pushed 3 separate probes into the station's outer perimeter over the next 10 days, probes, not assaults, feeling for weak points, which meant the main assault was still coming, and the only question was when. Daria ran her squad through prep drills in the mornings and spent her afternoons doing what she had always done during campaigns, which was gather information and think about it until something useful came out. She had a habit, when working a problem, of writing things down in a notebook rather than a datapad. Not because she didn't trust the datapad, but because her hand moved differently than her typing did, and the different movement produced different thoughts. The notebook was half full by the end of the 2nd week of Jacques' recovery, and most of what was in it was not about the Vorathi assault pattern. Most of it was questions she hadn't asked yet, and answers she hadn't figured out where to get. The orc girl Jacques, though none of the other soldiers called her that, they called her Tusks or the POW or Voss's project, was healing faster than Roth had expected. Vorathi metabolisms ran hot. By the end of the 1st week she could sit up. By the end of the 2nd she was standing, testing the repaired leg with careful, measured weight shifts, and watching everything in the medbay with those amber eyes. She had a stillness when she was observing that Daria associated with trained scouts. The kind of patient, comprehensive attention that came from years of learning to record information with no guarantee you'd have a device to record it with. She didn't talk much in those first 2 weeks. When she did talk, it was in standard, carefully, each word chosen with visible effort, as if the language were a tool she was still learning to hold without cutting herself. She asked questions sometimes, quiet ones, mostly directed at Roth because he was the least threatening person in the room, and because she seemed to have identified, correctly, that he was the one most likely to answer without consulting his chain of command first. What does this instrument measure? What does that light indicate? Why does the temperature in this room drop at night? Where do the other soldiers eat? What is the plant on that shelf, and why do you keep it here? The plant was a spider plant, a common one, the kind that grew from cuttings and needed almost nothing, and that Roth had brought in a small container from the supply depot because medbays without any green in them made the patients worse, he said. He'd read a study. Jacques looked at the plant for a long time and then looked at Roth and said, in careful standard, "You brought it here deliberately, for the people who are sick." And Roth said yes, and Jacques said, "We do not do that." And the way she said it wasn't judgment. It was something closer to genuine curiosity, the sound of a person encountering a fact that didn't fit the model they'd been working from. Once when Daria came in late one evening and found the girl awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Jacques asked her, "Why did your people come here?" Daria pulled up a chair and sat down. The question was not simple. It never was when it came to the Outer Rim worlds, with their 3 centuries of disputed jurisdiction and resource claims and broken treaties, and a history that looked completely different depending on which archive you pulled it from. But she answered it as honestly as she could. She said that humanity had come because there were people here already, colonists who'd been here for 2 generations, and who were getting hit by Vorathi raiding parties and not getting hit back. She said the colonists had children and farms, and a century of effort built into this rock, and that they were people she was responsible for whether or not she'd chosen the politics that put them here. She said she wasn't going to claim it was uncomplicated, because it wasn't. She said there were people in command who had motives she didn't agree with, and that the official history of why humanity was in the Outer Rim was a cleaner version of a messier truth. She said this partly because she believed in honesty, and partly because she was sitting in the dark with someone who would know immediately if she was repeating a prepared position instead of thinking for herself. Jacques was quiet through all of this. "Your people say," she said finally, "that this world belongs to the Vorathi Reach, that your colonists came without permission and have stayed through force." "I know what my people say and I know what your people say," Daria said. "I've read both sets of claims. There's probably something true in both of them. There's also a lot of dead people on both sides, and that part doesn't change based on who started it." The girl looked at her. "You are a strange soldier." "I've been told that. Most soldiers I have encountered only know what they are told to believe." "Most people only know what they're told to believe," Daria said. "Soldiers are people. Some of them think for themselves. Most of them don't, because thinking for yourself in a command structure is expensive, and the rewards are unreliable." "And you?" "I think for myself, and I have 2 disciplinary marks to prove it." Jacques considered this. In the Vorathi Reach, soldiers who contradict their commanding officers are reassigned to resource extraction work. "In the human military, they get disciplinary marks," Daria said. "It's a similar concept, except I kept getting assigned to places where my reasoning turned out to be correct, and eventually it became cheaper to let me be right than to keep disciplining me for it." The faintest thing happened at the corners of the girl's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. Vorathi facial musculature didn't map directly onto human expressions, but it was something. A small, involuntary softening. The recognition of something she hadn't expected to find here, in this room, in this conversation. Daria went back to her bunk and lay in the dark for a while before she slept, turning something over in her mind that she couldn't quite name yet. It had the shape of a question. It would come to her later, the way things always came to her in pieces, and then all at once. The 3rd week, Jacques began to talk. Not small, careful questions. Talk The kind that comes from someone who has been alone with things for long enough that the pressure of not saying them has become harder to bear than the risk of saying them. She had been a scout. Third rank, attached to a forward assessment unit whose job was to map human defensive positions before major operations. Not to fight, to look and report. To move through a landscape and understand it well enough to tell someone else how to use it. She was good at it. She said this without pride, just as fact. Her pod had malfunctioned during deorbit. She didn't know why. Mechanical failure or interference, there was no way to determine which from inside the pod with 7 seconds between the warning alarm and the ground. She'd braced. She'd been unconscious before impact. Her unit, she said, did not know she'd survived. They would have counted her among the dead before the end of that day. So they won't come looking for you, Daria said. No, a pause, the particular kind of pause that people take around painful things. They do not recover the dead, it is not our custom. She said it simply, without apparent self-pity. But Daria had been around enough soldiers for enough years to hear what was underneath the simplicity, the specific loneliness of someone who has been trained to expect no rescue. Who has never, in their operational life, been the person that someone turned around and came back for. Who had absorbed the logic that this was strength, and who was now lying in a cot where someone had come back and set her leg and brought a plant and sat in the dark with her, and did not quite know what to do with the evidence that a different logic was possible. We pulled you out of that wreckage, Daria said. For whatever that's worth. Jacques looked at her wrist at the braided cord. It is worth something, she said quietly. I am still learning what. The other thing Jacques began to talk about carefully, not as an intelligence asset performing a transaction, but as a scout thinking out loud about the ground she'd been mapping, was the tactical situation. She said the Vorathi field commander for this sector, a veteran named Kethvor, no relation. It was a common clan syllable the way Smith was common in some human languages, had been systematically cataloging human sensor grids for 3 full rotation cycles. Not randomly. With specific focus on the intersection points of multiple coverage areas, the places where the overlap created redundancy, but also on the places where the geometry of the terrain meant the coverage had gaps. She said it the way a good scout talked about a landscape she'd walked, not as intelligence product but as texture, as the things that had worried her. She said the eastern approach to this station had always bothered her when she was studying the schematic maps. There was an atmospheric interference pattern there from the mining operations. She'd flagged it in her assessment notes. She didn't know if anyone had followed up on her notes. She said, if I were the field commander, and I had been studying this sector for 3 cycles, that is where I would look. Daria pulled up the station's sensor grid schematics that night and stared at them for 3 hours. There was a gap, not huge, not obvious, the kind of thing that showed up as a minor annotation in the technical review and then got deprioritized because there were always more urgent maintenance items, and the eastern approach was rocky and unpromising, and the Vorathi had never come from that direction. 200 meters wide, 18 meters of altitude range. A corridor that ran between 2 methane extraction rigs where the particulate discharge threw off radar returns at low altitude. If you came in low enough, in something with no active emissions, the station's eastern perimeter was effectively blind. She drafted a recommendation memo to Lieutenant Farrow. She spent 4 hours on the memo and she was aware, the whole time she was writing it, of a familiar feeling, the feeling of having something true in her hands and needing to make it transmissible, to translate the thing she could see into a form that someone else would believe. The schematics annotated, the sensor data attached with calculations, the reasoning laid out in 3 separate frameworks in case one of them didn't land. She was good at the translation work. She'd had a lot of practice. She did not include, in the memo, any reference to where the initial observation had come from. She had been in the military long enough to know what would happen to the observation if she did. Pharaoh read the memo the next morning. He read it twice, actually, which surprised her. Then he called her into his office and looked at her from across the desk with the expression of a man who had arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion and wanted her to tell him he was wrong about it. "Your source for this assessment," he said, "it's the POW." It was not a question. Part of the assessment comes from cross-referencing our sensor data against known Vorathi operational patterns in analogous environments, Daria said. The interference pattern has been in our technical documentation for 8 months. The gap is real, and it's in the schematics, sir. The schematics show a minor anomaly. Your memo turns it into an attack corridor with a specific approach profile. The sensor data supports the profile. Given 3 cycles of systematic perimeter analysis on the Vorathi side, and their established pattern of probing for weak points before committing to a main assault. I understand the argument, Voss. Then what's the objection, sir? He leaned back. He had the look of a man who was caught between 2 versions of something going wrong. If I move resources based on this, I'm depleting coverage elsewhere. If it's nothing, we have better eastern coverage and we've spent a day repositioning. If it's something and we don't act on it, she stopped herself. I know you understand the arithmetic, sir. I'm not going to walk you through it again. The source, he said. You're asking me to act on intelligence from an enemy combatant. I'm asking you to act on a sensor gap that's documented in our own systems. The enemy combatant gave me a direction to look. I looked. What I found when I looked is ours. He stared at her. She let the silence sit. I'll have engineering look at the sensor array, he said. Tonight would be better than tomorrow, sir. He sent the engineering team that evening. What happened 4 days later happened fast, the way it always does when something has been building for a long time and then finds the shape of its release. The Vorathi assault came in 2 simultaneous vectors. The Western approach, loud, heavily armed, everything you expected from a Vorathi main assault, drone swarms and suppression fire and infantry advancing on the primary perimeter in numbers that forced an immediate full defensive response. The station's attention, predictably, went west. The eastern corridor went quiet until it wasn't. 2 squads of assault troops in atmospheric gliders, no active emissions, no radar signature, coming up the blind between the methane rigs at low altitude in the dark. The corridor was exactly the profile Daria had modeled. The gliders were exactly the equipment type a commander would use for a low-altitude penetration approach. They came in at 17 meters, under the modified coverage threshold, moving fast. They found 3 mobile sensor arrays repositioned to cover the corridor. 2 automated gun platforms pulled from storage and registered to the new field of fire. Daria's squad plus a second element dug into the 2 choke points. The coverage was not perfect. Nothing in a combat zone is ever perfect. But it was there, which was everything. The eastern assault lasted 11 minutes. The western assault, deprived of the penetration it had depended on to succeed, lasted another 40 before withdrawing. The station held. The colonists in the shelter rings held. No one on the human side died that night. Daria sat in the sensor room afterward with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and wrote up the engagement report. She was precise and complete, and she cited the sensor data and the repositioning decision and Pharaoh's authorization and the engineering team's work. She noted the result. She did not note the conversation in the medbay that had given her the direction. That conversation was in her notebook, not in any system, and she had thought carefully about whether it needed to be anywhere else, and had concluded that the result was the record that mattered. The truth of what had happened was in the outcome. The outcome spoke for itself. She didn't expect to feel much about it. She had held positions under fire before, and she was past the age where holding a position felt like an achievement. It was work, and the work had gone correctly, and people were alive who wouldn't have been. That was the whole ledger. But there was the other thing, the smaller, less defensible thing. She had pulled a wounded girl out of a crash site 3 weeks ago, and the wounded girl had talked to her in the dark, and the thing the girl had said had saved lives. Not because Jacques had intended to save them. Because Daria had been the kind of person who sat in the dark with someone and listened, and because listening had turned out to matter. She drank the cold coffee and finished the report, and went to find Roth to make sure he knew he'd done good work. The morning after the assault, she found Jacques awake in the medbay with her eyes fixed on the door. She'd been awake for hours. The amber eyes moved to Daria when she came in and stayed there. "You held," Jacques said. "We held." Jacques looked down at her hands for a moment, three-fingered, broad, capable hands with short, thick nails. She turned them palm up, then palm down, as if checking something. "I told you about the corridor," she said. "I did not tell you as an operative. I told you as a person thinking out loud about the ground. I know what you told me and how you told it. The others, your soldiers, do they know the origin of the assessment?" "They know we had good intelligence on the approach vector," Daria said. "They don't know the source." "Why do you protect that?" Daria sat down and thought about how to answer. Because the information is only as useful as people's willingness to act on it. If they knew the source, half of them would have been watching the Eastern approach with one eye and watching you with the other. Split attention at a critical moment gets people killed. The information needed to stand on its own without carrying the weight of where it came from. Jacques absorbed this. The truth is more powerful when it is freed from its origin. "Sometimes," Daria said. "Not always, but in this case, yes." "In my experience," Jacques said slowly, "the Vorathi approach to this problem is different. The origin of information is never separated from its content. Who said a thing is as important as what they said. A scout of 4th rank does not carry the same weight as a commander of 6th. The same report from different sources has different value. Different truth, almost." "That's true of humans too," Daria said. "It's just supposed to be a bias we account for, not a feature of the system." "Does it work, the accounting?" "Sometimes. When there's someone in the room who's willing to say, 'This data is what it is regardless of who brought it.' When there's someone willing to take the argument on its merits." Jacques looked at her steadily. "You do that?" "I try." "It costs you something." "2 disciplinary marks," Daria said, "and a lot of cold coffee." Something shifted in the girl's expression again, that involuntary softening, broader this time, less careful. "The Vorathi word for someone who does what you do," she said, "is a compound word. Literally, it translates as something like, the one who is correct at the wrong time." "That's very accurate," Daria said. "It is not intended as a compliment in the reach. It isn't always intended as one here either." They sat with the morning quiet of the station around them, the sounds of routine settling back in after crisis, the particular hum of systems running normally that you only noticed when you'd been listening for abnormalities. Outside the medbay window, the eastern ridge of the station's perimeter was visible in the early light, the methane rigs casting long shadows. Daria looked at them and thought about 17 meters of altitude and 200 meters of corridor, and a gap that had been in the documentation for 8 months with nobody looking at it right. "What happens to me now?" Jacques said. It was the first time she'd asked it directly. "That depends on the war," Daria said. She was honest about this because Jacques would know immediately if she wasn't. "If there's a negotiated settlement, you'd be part of an exchange. If the conflict escalates, command will want to interrogate you formally. There are people above my pay grade who will eventually want to know you exist." She paused. "I'll tell you what I know, and I won't tell you what I don't. What I know is that you're here, you're healing, and you're my responsibility right now. I'll deal with the complications when they arrive." Jacques looked at her for a moment. "You could have told me something easier." "I could have, it wouldn't have been true." No, Jacques said. It would not have been. She looked down at the braided cord again, touching the knots in sequence, reading them in some way Daria didn't fully understand yet. In my unit we had a saying, that the Vorathi do not need the goodwill of their enemies, that to need anything from the people who oppose you is weakness that will be used against you. And I have been lying in this cot for 3 weeks needing the goodwill of my enemies. She said it without drama, just as an observed fact. And it has been given, without conditions, and I do not know what to do with that. It does not fit any framework I have for understanding this kind of conflict. Daria thought about the right thing to say. She had learned over the years that there was usually a right thing and several easier things, and that choosing between them was where character actually lived. Maybe, she said, the conflict isn't the only framework there is. Jacques looked up. The amber eyes were very clear. Maybe, she said, and then, very quietly, I think I would like to learn your framework, the one that has room for the plant in the medbay and the cold coffee and the memo that does not say where its best information came from. I think it is a more useful framework than the one I was given. It has its own problems, Daria said. All frameworks do. Yeah, Daria said. Yeah, they do. She went out to write her morning assessment and left the girl to the work of recovery, which was slower than people admitted and required more than medicine. The war did not end quickly. Wars on the outer rim never did. They had too many interested parties with too many irreconcilable positions, and too much infrastructure sunk into the conflict to allow for easy resolution. What happened instead was the long, grinding arithmetic of attrition and negotiation, and the slow, painful accumulation of events that shifted the balance of advantage by degrees. Over the following months, Daria's station held its ground. The Eastern Corridor became a standard element of the defensive protocol, not by order, but because the soldiers who had fought there knew its value and wrote it into their own institutional memory. The station's kill rate declined, and its hold rate improved. More colonists made it through to the next season's harvest. That was the metric that mattered, even if nobody in the after-action reports used the word harvest. Pharaoh was reassigned to a rear command position after the engagement. His replacement, a major named Chen who had done 3 tours in the inner sectors before volunteering for the Rim, read Daria's personnel file, and then called her into his office and said, without preamble, "Your record is strange. You want to tell me about that?" She told him about it, the citations and the disciplinary marks both, without edits. He listened without expression, which was a good sign. Officers who showed you their expressions while you were talking were usually preparing a response rather than listening. When she finished, he said, "The disciplinary marks are primarily for going around or directly challenging your chain of command when they weren't engaging with your assessments." "Yes, sir." "Were you right?" 3 times out of 3, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "The first mark is from the Callum Station campaign. You argued against the defensive posture selected by your commanding officer at the time." "Yes, sir." "I believe the posture left the southern axis exposed." "The southern axis was breached on day 4 of the campaign." "Yes, sir, after I had been formally disciplined and removed from the planning cycle." Chen looked at her for a long time. There was something assessing in it that she recognized as the look of a person, deciding whether to trust an asset or a person. She had been assessed both ways by different people over her career, and she had strong feelings about which she preferred. "Good enough," he said. "Don't go around me if you can avoid it, but don't sit on something important because you're worried about the channel." She nodded. "One other thing," he said, "the POW situation. Roth briefed me. I've read your incident reports. I want you to understand that I know what isn't in them." She held his gaze. "The Eastern approach coverage," he said, "the specificity of the profile in your memo, the timing." He paused. "I'm not asking you to tell me where it came from. I'm telling you that I can read a memo and I can read what isn't in it, and I'm choosing to trust both. Yes, sir. That girl is still your responsibility, he said. How she's managed, how she's treated, what happens when command wants to formalize her situation. I'll back you on the approach you've been taking, as long as the results continue to justify it. Daria went back to her work. Jacquet's leg healed completely by the end of the second month. She began helping in the medbay first small things, assisting Roth with inventory and cleaning, and then larger things, because Roth turned out to be right that she was observant and careful and learned quickly. She had been trained for observation and careful operation in hostile environments. The skills translated. Roth was 23 now and spoke passable Vorathi, and had taken to leaving his translation matrix off sometimes when Jacquet was around, making himself work for the comprehension. She corrected his pronunciation with a patience that surprised him, and helped him understand not just the sounds but the grammar structures underneath them, which were architecturally so different from any human language that learning Vorathi without understanding the architecture was like trying to build a wall without understanding load-bearing. She kept asking questions, not about tactics now or not primarily, about humans, about the photographs people kept, about the plant in the medbay which had grown 2 new trailing stems since she'd arrived, about why certain soldiers ate together and others didn't, about the meaning of specific gestures she'd observed, about what music was for, because the Vorathi had music but it served a different function. It was ceremonial, collective, used in specific ritual contexts, and human music seemed to be for something else, something more individual, something she couldn't quite identify from observation alone. Daria told her it was for the same reason as the plant, for the people in the room, for making the space bearable when it wasn't. Jacquet thought about this for a long time. You carry a great many things to make the space bearable, she said. Photographs and plants and music and what else? Humor, Daria said. Routine, coffee, badly made but present. Arguments with people you respect about things that matter. The knowledge that the person in the bunk next to yours will not let you die without trying. We have that last one, Jacquet said. I know you do, Daria said. The difference is probably in what you'll fight for to have it. The negotiation that eventually ended the sector conflict came from an unexpected direction. Nobody announced it as a negotiation, because calling it that would have required both sides to admit they were having one, which neither was politically able to do while active engagement was still occurring. What it was, practically, was a sustained exchange through a neutral communications relay between assessment officers on both sides who had been, for years, doing the same job from opposite ends of the same conflict, and who had slowly and carefully and very quietly been sharing the kind of analysis that allowed them to predict each other with increasing accuracy. Scouts and intelligence officers, the people whose job it was to understand the enemy well enough to anticipate them, who had arrived, independently and through different reasoning, at the conclusion that the thing they had in common, the assessment work, the honest weighing of evidence, the institutional distrust of convenient conclusions, was more reliable than the positions they'd been handed to defend. It was not official. It was barely legal under the engagement protocols of either side. It was also the most important work happening in the sector. When Daria found out about it, after the ceasefire announcement, she was not surprised. She was surprised by who had been one of the key figures in the exchange. Not a high-ranking officer, but a junior-level Vorathi scout, third rank, who had been sending careful, precise assessments through the relay channel for the better part of a year. Assessments that were apparently notable for their honesty about the limits of Vorathi operational advantages and their accurate modeling of human defensive responses. She did not read the name on the assessment records until after the ceasefire, when the document package came through the new intersector coordination framework. When she did, she sat with it for a long time. The morning the ceasefire was announced, she was in the medbay. She had been in the medbay, she would realize later, because she had understood before she'd consciously understood that Jacques would already know, and that there was something important about being there. Jacques was sitting upright on the cot she had occupied for months, awake, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window. She looked like someone who had been thinking for hours and had arrived somewhere. "The ceasefire," she said when Daria came in. "Yes," Daria said. "There will be a transfer, a collection point, then neutral station, then," she paused, "then I don't know." "Probably not quickly," Daria said. "The logistics of ceasefire implementation are slow. You'll have time." Neither of them said what they were not saying, which was that they were thinking about the time ending. "What will you do," Jacques said, "after this?" "Sector coordination work, probably," Daria said. "They'll want people who have experience on the front lines running the liaison protocols. I've been asked to put my name in for a joint advisory posting." She paused. "I'll probably do it. It's the work that needs doing." "You always choose the work that needs doing," Jacques said, "even when it is inconvenient." "Especially then." "Yes," Jacques said. "I have observed that about you." They sat together until the morning light through the porthole window shifted from the flat gray of early hours to the pale amber of a mining sector morning, the kind of light that had no beauty exactly but had presence, a quality of being simply there and sufficient. "In 3 years," Jacques said slowly, "if the peace holds, there will be exchange programs. Scout officers who were in prisoner situations become something like cultural liaisons. Informally. The Reach has done it on the inner rim. It is not official, but in practice the channel functions." "You be good at that," Daria said. "I have learned from a good teacher," Jacques said, and then before Daria could respond, "The Vorathi do not say goodbye. We say there is a word, a compound. Literally, I will recognize you when I see you again. It is for people you separate from who you expect will return in some form, in some context, eventually." Daria stood up. "Same concept," she said, "different language." When the transport call came, Jacques stood steadily, on a leg that had healed clean, and looked at Daria for a moment. Then she held out her right wrist, the braided cord flat and visible. "Do you see the new knot?" she said. Daria looked. Near the center of the cord, added recently, a complex double loop different in structure from the others. "The geometry of this knot," Jacques said, "is for someone who carries meaning without debt, someone who is simply known. Someone you carry because to not carry them would be to lose something that should not be lost." She looked up. "You are in the cord." Daria looked at the knot. She looked at it for a long time. "I don't need a knot," she said. "The cord doesn't ask what you need," Jacques said. "It records what is true." She walked to the door and through it, and the transport bay sound swallowed her, and Daria stood at the medbay window and watched the organized motion of the ceasefire taking shape around her, all the machinery of something large beginning to change, and thought about what was true. 3 years after the ceasefire, on a neutral station that had not existed before the conflict, and would become one of the most important diplomatic hubs on the outer rim over the following decade, Daria was attending a joint intersector conference that 2 years prior had been described as impractical, 1 year prior as aspirational, and was now simply a scheduled event on the coordination calendar. She was standing in the corridor outside the main conference chamber, reviewing her briefing notes, when she heard a voice she recognized. Not the sound of it, the quality of it. The particular precision of someone who had learned standard as a working language and had decided to use it exactly, as a discipline. She looked up. Jacques had cut her tusks differently. Higher, sharper, the configuration that indicated professional seniority in Vorathi culture, the way a certain cut of jacket indicated rank in human professional settings. She was in a formal uniform that occupied the same ambiguous territory as Daria's own liaison designation. Not military, not civilian, something newer than both. She was in the middle of a rapid exchange with two other Vorathi officers, and she was gesturing with one hand as she spoke, a specific gesture. Hand held flat, moved in a small deliberate arc. The Vorathi equivalent of, consider this from the other side. When she saw Daria, she stopped mid-gesture. The two officers she'd been talking to turned. Daria stood in the corridor and was seen, which was all that was required. Jacques said something brief to the other officers. They moved away. She crossed the corridor to where Daria was standing and stopped, and they looked at each other across the weight of 3 years and a war and a cord with a knot in it. Jacques held up her wrist. The cord was there. Longer now, more knots, more people, more years of what was true. Daria found the one she remembered. Still in the cord, Jacques said. Good, Daria said. Her voice was steady, which she was grateful for. How are you? I am inconvenient, Jacques said. For them, as predicted. Good, Daria said again. That's the right thing to be. I learned it from somewhere, Jacques said. Daria made the sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite something else. 3 years and a war and a different station and the same sound. Immediately recognizable, immediately right. Come on, Daria said. I've been saving a seat for the inconvenient people. They went into the conference room together. There was a great deal of work to do, there always was, at the edges of peace, where the hard, slow work of making something durable lived. Most of it would require arguing with people who didn't want to hear it. Most of it would happen in rooms like this one, without witnesses, without recognition, the way the most important work usually did. Daria sat down, opened her assessment log and began. The cord was on the wrist of the person next to her. The plant in the medbay had grown 3 more trailing stems. Somewhere back on KL7, Roth was probably still there, probably still keeping it alive, because he'd read a study and he believed in it, and that was the kind of thing that outlasted almost everything else. The small, stubborn, unremarkable human acts of making the space bearable, of deciding that the person across from you was worth the trouble of understanding, of being, when it mattered, the person who sat in the dark and listened. These were the things that held, not the weapons or the defensive postures or the tactical genius of well-placed sensor arrays, though those things mattered in their moment. What held was the argument made clearly and the answer given honestly, and the cord that recorded what was true whether or not you needed it to. What held was this: a soldier who would not walk away, and a girl who learned what that meant, and the long, slow, difficult work of 2 people deciding that the framework they had been handed was not the only framework available. One argued truth at a time. That was enough, that had always been enough. It was the only thing that ever had been. But the conference itself was not the whole story. Nothing as clean as a conference ever was. The first session was about resource extraction rights in 3 disputed belt corridors. The kind of negotiation that sounded technical, until you understood that the belts fed 2 million colonists on the human side and 3 habitat rings in the Vorathi reach, and that getting it wrong meant children going hungry in the way that children had been going hungry in the outer rim for 50 years, just on different sides of the same poverty line. Daria was not a diplomat and had never pretended to be. Her role in the session was to provide operational context, what the extraction sites actually looked like from the ground, what the security requirements were, what the human operators who worked the rigs had told her when she'd done her preparatory interviews. She had done the preparatory interviews carefully. She always did. What the rig operators told her mostly was that they were tired, that they had been working in a conflict zone for years, and they had developed a functional relationship with the Vorathi workers on the adjacent stations. A relationship that the official conflict had not managed to fully erase, because when you are 400 meters below the surface of a rock in an extraction shaft, What matters is whether the person next to you knows what they're doing. And ethnicity and species and political alignment don't weigh much against competence and reliability. One of the operators, a woman in her 50s who had been running an extraction crew for 22 years, and who had the specific weathered patience of someone who has outlasted multiple rounds of the same argument, told Daria that she had worked alongside Vorathi crews 3 times during the years when the political situation had briefly been functional enough to allow it. She said it was good work. She said the Vorathi had a different approach to the methane processing, more conservative in their extraction rates, slower but with less equipment degradation, and that she had changed her own protocols after observing theirs. "Did you tell anyone that?" Daria asked. The woman had looked at her with the expression of someone who had been in the outer rim long enough to know what that question meant. "I wrote it up in my maintenance logs," she said. "I don't know if anyone read them." Daria had written this up. She had written up a great deal from the preparatory interviews. The document ran to 63 pages, which was longer than anyone in the coordination hub had expected, and which her liaison supervisor had initially suggested trimming to an executive summary. Daria had kept the 63 pages and added a 10-page executive summary at the front. In the first session of the conference, when the Vorathi negotiating team's lead technical officer raised a concern about extraction rate protocols in the Northern Belt, framing it as a safety issue on their side, Daria was able to pull up the relevant section of her documentation and reference the 22-year operator's observations about the Vorathi approach to methane processing. She could speak to the specific technical logic. She could note that a human operator had independently arrived at similar conclusions and had, quietly, changed her protocols accordingly. The Vorathi technical officer looked at her across the table for a moment. "You spoke with our contractors," he said, "not an accusation, a recalibration." "I spoke with human contractors who had worked alongside Vorathi crews on previous joint operations," Daria said. "The observations in my documentation are from a human source about practices she observed and found useful. I don't have direct testimony from your side." "You could have," he said, "if you had asked." "I know," Daria said. "I'm asking now." It was a small moment. It wouldn't appear in any official record of the session as anything other than a routine technical exchange. But Jacques, who was in the room as part of the Vorathi cultural liaison contingent, and who was not supposed to be involved in the technical discussions, caught Daria's eye across the table. The amber gaze was level and warm, and contained exactly the same small, involuntary softening that it had contained on a cot in a medbay on Kale 3 years ago, in the dark, when a stubborn human soldier had sat down next to her and refused to treat the truth as a problem. Daria turned back to her documentation. The afternoon sessions were harder. The afternoon sessions were where the territorial claims lived, and territorial claims were where the grief lived. The grief of the colonists who had built something on a world and been told it wasn't theirs, and the grief of the Vorathi clans who had charted a system 200 years before the first human ship arrived, and had been told that charting wasn't the same as owning. Both griefs were real. Both griefs had dead people in them. The conference was not going to resolve them, and everyone in the room knew it. And the thing they were actually doing was trying to build a structure around them that was durable enough to let people live. Daria had always been better at the technical sessions than the territorial ones. She was good at the concrete, the verifiable, the thing you could point to. Territorial claims lived in history and law and emotion, and the specific sorrow of generations of loss, and she was not equipped to resolve those things, and she knew it. What she could do was stay in the room and listen, and not pretend that the grief was simpler than it was, and make her contributions when she had something useful to contribute. What she had in the late afternoon was a specific data point from her preparatory work that no one else in the room seemed to have. It was a survey, an old one, 90 years old, from the period before the conflict had formalized, when the Outer Rim had been a loosely administered space where human and Vorathi explorers had moved through sometimes overlapping territories. The survey was from a joint expedition, one of several dozen that had occurred in that period, before the territorial claims calcified. It had been conducted by a mixed crew, and its findings had been co-published under both human and Vorathi academic institutional affiliations. The survey showed that the particular rock cluster at the center of the Northern Belt dispute had been visited by the joint expedition and had been assessed as geologically significant by the Vorathi team member and as having potential for human colonization by the human team member. Both assessments were in the same document. Both team members had signed off on both findings. It was not a resolution. It was not a legal instrument. What it was evidence that there had been a moment 90 years ago, briefly, when the two sides had been in the same place at the same time looking at the same thing and finding, each from their own perspective, something worth caring about, and had written it down together. Daria presented this late in the afternoon session. She did not present it as a solution. She presented it as a fact she had found when she had been looking at other things that seemed relevant to the texture of the disagreement. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the senior Vorathi negotiators said something in Vorathi that Daria's matrix rendered as, "We have a copy of this survey in our institutional archive. It was filed under joint works. We did not know you had it." "I found it in a regional archive on KL7 Colonial Database," Daria said. "It was misfiled under geological surveys. I found it because I read all the geological surveys." "Why did you read all the geological surveys?" the negotiator said. "Because you never know where the useful thing is going to be," Daria said. "And I had time in the evenings." This time the sound that came from the Vorathi side of the table was unmistakable, a dry, short exhalation with a click at the end. The one that meant the recognition of something ironic, dry amusement at the absurdity of where the important things ended up living. The human delegates looked at each other, uncertain. Daria, who had been hearing that sound for 3 years, let herself smile. Jacques, across the room, was very carefully not looking at her. The dinner that followed the afternoon sessions was semi-formal, the kind of event that everyone said was optional and everyone attended. Daria ate quickly and found a seat at the edge of the room where she could watch without being in the center of things, which was where she was most comfortable. Jacques found her there an hour in. She sat down without ceremony and said, without preamble, "The geological survey." "I found it," Daria said. "You found it because you read all the geological surveys." "In the evenings. On KL7. I didn't have a lot of other activities." Jacques was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was full of the particular noise of people in competing groups attempting something difficult over food, the sound of formal ease, which was always harder to achieve than either formality or ease alone. "When I first got the assessment role," she said, "I was told to build intelligence products, specific, formatted, optimized for decision support. I was good at it, but I kept writing the longer version first, the version with the context that didn't fit the format. My supervisor kept telling me to cut it." "Did you?" "I cut it from the official product," Jacques said. "I kept the longer version in a separate file. I sent both." Daria looked at her. "The longer version," Jacques said, "is why Stone Eye contacted me about the liaison channel. He had read it. He said it sounded like someone who was trying to tell the truth rather than to make a case. He said those were different things." She paused. "He said he had met a human once who did the same thing. He gave me a description that I recognized." "Stone Eye," Daria said. "The officer who met me in the liaison posting orientation." "Yes, my former unit commander." The amber eyes were direct. "He told me about that meeting." "He told me about yours," Daria said. They sat for a moment with the weight of the fact between them, that the threads of what they had been to each other had been traveling through other people, accumulating, finding their way. The longer version of the assessment, Daria said, 63 pages. I heard about your preparatory report, Jacques said, and the corners of her eyes shifted. In the briefing notes this morning, several of the Vorathi delegates mentioned it, with varying degrees of complaint about its length. Good, Daria said. Yes, Jacques said. Good. And then, not moving, not making a large thing of it, I told a junior scout in my unit last year that the most important thing about assessment work is that you record what you found, not what you were looking for. She asked me where I had learned that. I told her from a soldier on the outer rim who read all the geological surveys in the evenings. Daria looked at the table. I hope she keeps the longer version, she said. I made sure of it, Jacques said. Outside the dining room windows, the neutral station's artificial sky was cycling through the color sequence that passed for evening here, a slow shift from pale blue to a deep amber that the station designers had clearly optimized for somewhere between human and Vorathi preference, a compromise color that didn't quite match either species' homeworld but had a quality of its own, present and sufficient. Daria had come to think of it as the color of the outer rim itself. Not what anyone would have chosen, but real and workable, and in its own way, after you had looked at it long enough, not without beauty. Thank you, Jacques said. It was a simple sentence, and she said it simply, and in standard, not in Vorathi, and Daria understood that this was deliberate, that she was choosing the language of the person she was thanking rather than her own, and that in the choosing was the whole content of the thing being said. You did the work, Daria said. You gave me the direction to look, Jacques said, like the sensor gap. And you found something there. Yes, Jacques said, I found something there. Later, alone in her quarters in the station's residential wing, Daria sat at the small desk and opened her notebook. Not a data pad. The actual notebook, the one she had carried through KL7 and the sector hub and the liaison posting and here. The pages were dense with the compressed handwriting of years of thinking in private, half-formed arguments and censored data and questions without answers. And occasionally, things she had needed to set down somewhere simply because they were true and needed a place to live. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the location. She wrote in the compressed shorthand she used when she was recording rather than analyzing. Conference Day 1. Joint Session, Northern Belt Geological Survey. Vorathi Technical Exchange, successful. Long version assessment vindicated again. Then she stopped and held the pen for a moment. She wrote ZK, same, 3 years still in the cord. She looked at it. She wrote underneath in regular handwriting rather than shorthand, because some things shouldn't be abbreviated. The truth gets lost in the noise if there's nobody willing to dig it out. That is not a tragedy. That is a problem with a solution. The solution is the person who reads the geological surveys in the evenings, the person who keeps the long version, the person who sits in the dark and listens and then does the thing that the thing she heard requires. She closed the notebook. She took out the photograph from the inner pocket of her field jacket, her sister's family, the kids who were older now, who she'd actually seen twice in the past 3 years, which was more than she'd managed in the decade before that. She looked at them for a moment. Then she put the photograph away and turned off the light and lay in the dark, and let the day be finished, and let the work that was done be done, and let the work that remained wait for morning. Somewhere on the other side of the station, a Vorathi scout with amber eyes and a braided cord, and a complex knot that recorded something true, was probably doing exactly the same thing. The cord recorded what was true. That was enough. It had always been enough.